At 30 years old, 4 years after a husband who slipped out the back door of her life without slamming it. Margaret Ellis stood on the porch of a house the county had valued at $400 and pushed open a door her father had hung in secret. She had no money. She had no plan. Her two older siblings had taken the company, the family home, the savings, the truck. Even the photograph of her grandfather that used to sit on the office wall. People in Mill Hollow watched her drive out to the end of Old Hollow Road in a car with 140,000 miles on it and shook their heads and called it a pity. A girl that young, they said, left with nothing but a piece of land at the end of nowhere. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the inside of that house had nothing to do with the outside. And what her father had built behind those rough plywood walls would change every single thing about who she thought she was. Before we go any further, if old stories about quiet people and the things they leave behind mean something to you, take a moment now to subscribe. Pull up your blanket, settle in. This one is going to take a while and it is meant to be heard slowly. The funeral was on a Tuesday morning in October. 300 people filled First Baptist of Mill Hollow, which was the kind of crowd usually reserved for the longtime mayor or the high school football coach who died young. Walter Ellis had been neither. He had been a carpenter. He had run Ellis Carpentry out of a tin roof shop on the edge of town for 40 years, and he had never once delivered a job he was ashamed of. That was the line the pastor used, and for once, the pastor was not exaggerating. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers. A woman from the post office, who must have been 70, told the man beside her that Walter had rehung her storm door for free the winter her husband was in the hospital. She had never forgotten. A retired sheriff said Walter built the cabinets in his kitchen at cost, then came back 6 months later and adjusted the hinges because the wood had settled, and would not let him pay a dime for the second visit. The stories ran together until they became one story told in different voices about the same man. Maggie stood near the back of the church in a black dress Opal Whitcomb had pressed for her the night before. The dress was a half size too large in the shoulders, and she kept tugging at the sleeves so they would sit right. In her right hand, hidden against the fold of her skirt, she held a brass plumb bob on a length of waxed cotton string. The bob was the size of a small pear, heavy in the palm, worn smooth at the tip from a century of use. It had belonged to her grandfather, Elias, who had carried it across the Atlantic in a wooden toolbox in 1923. Walter had pressed it into her hand the week before he died. His grip had been almost nothing by then, but his eyes had been clear. A plumb line tells you what's true even when the wall lies. Remember that. She thought it was the morphine. It wasn't. Curtis sat in the front pew in a charcoal suit and a silver tie and shoes that had never touched a job site. He was 38, 8 years older than Maggie, and he had run the books at Ellis Carpentry for almost a decade. He worked the room before the service, shaking hands, nodding, accepting condolences in the practiced way of a man who had learned that grief, like everything else, could be efficiently administered. Lorraine sat 2 seats away, 35 soft around the eyes, married to a man who sold farm insurance. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face turned slightly toward the stained glass on the east wall, and she did not look at anyone for very long. Opal Whitcomb had driven 40 minutes in from the property out on Old Hollow Road. She was 76 and had known Walter since before Maggie was born. She lived on the parcel of land that bordered the lot Walter had bought at the tax auction, and she was the only person in that church who did not seem surprised by anything the pastor said. When the service let out, she squeezed Maggie's hand on the way through the doorway and held it a half-beat longer than a stranger would have. "Come see me when you are ready. There are things you need to know." Maggie barely registered the words. Her hearing had gone strange in the last 2 weeks, the way it does after a long sickness in the house. Everything sounded like it was coming from another room. After the last casserole dish was carried out and the last car had pulled away from the lot, Curtis found her in the empty fellowship hall. He did not lower his voice. He did not begin with anything that resembled comfort. "We need to talk about the business." No pause, no grief, just the business. The days between the funeral and the will reading were the worst kind of quiet. Maggie stayed in her father's house because she had nowhere else to go. Daniel had been gone 4 years, the divorce signed by mail from a return address in Ohio she had never visited. There had been no children to consider. There had only been an empty side of the bed. And then the year she moved back home to take care of Walter. And then the long, slow narrowing of her life into a single hallway between the kitchen and the bedroom, where her father was dying. His reading glasses sat on the end table beside his chair, folded the way he had folded them. His work boots stood by the back door with the laces still loose from the last time he had stepped out of them. She did not move either. She made tea in the kitchen where she had fed him his last meal of broth and toast, and she sat with both hands around the mug and listened to the house settle around her shoulders. Ellis Carpentry was not a large company, but it had contracts, 2 trucks, 4 full-time men, and a name in that part of the state. Walter had run it for 40 years. He had never once finished a job that did not pass inspection on the first walkthrough. None of that had interested Curtis or Lorraine while their father was alive. But now that he was gone, it interested them both very much. Maggie had grown up on her father's job sites, not from a distance. She had ridden in his truck from the time she could buckle her own seatbelt. Saturday mornings, summer days, school holidays. She had sat on overturned 5-gallon buckets while he checked foundations, and he had taught her to read a crack in concrete the way other fathers taught their daughters to read sheet music, to tell settling from structural failure, to press her palm flat against a wall and feel for the framing behind it. Everything starts with what's underneath, Maggie. If the foundation lies, the whole house lies. She had been 7 the first time he told her that. She had been 27 when she enrolled in the graduate architecture program at the State University 3 hours west. She had been 28 when she withdrew. The doctors had said pancreatic cancer. They had said a year, give or take. She had packed up her studio apartment over the course of a weekend and driven home and slept on the cot in the living room for the next 11 months. Curtis flew in twice in that year. Lorraine came on Sundays and stayed for the casserole, and not much longer. Maggie had bathed her father and read him the newspaper aloud in the evenings because television gave him headaches and silence gave him fear. She had been holding his hand on a Wednesday afternoon when he stopped breathing. The room had been so quiet that she heard the refrigerator click on in the kitchen. The will reading was at the lawyer's office on Friday. The attorney was a thin, careful man named Reuben Hatcher, who had handled Walter's affairs for 15 years and had known the family since Maggie was small. He opened the folder with the unhurried respect of a man who understood that paper properly read could break a person in half. Everything was to be divided equally among Walter's 3 children: the business, the house, the savings, the trucks, the tools, 1/3 each. Maggie sat across the table from her brother and sister. Equal. She had spent a year at her father's bedside. Curtis had spent 4 nights. Lorraine had brought soup. And now the 3 of them would divide it all the same. Curtis was already checking his phone. Lorraine watched the lawyer's hands. Then came the last line. The property at Old Hollow Road, Parcel 1147, is left solely to my daughter, Margaret Ellis. Curtis looked up. What property? Reuben Hatcher read the description in his flat, careful voice. 3.2 acres at the end of a county road, roughly 40 minutes outside town. A structure on the lot listed as a single-family residence, unfinished. Walter had purchased it at a tax auction 8 years earlier. Price paid $400. $400, Curtis repeated. That is correct. Curtis glanced at Maggie. His face showed nothing. No malice, no sympathy. She did not even register on his expression. Keep it. Lorraine looked at her then. Something moved behind her eyes, too quick to name gone before Maggie could lean toward it. Lorraine turned away and signed her name at the bottom of the page. What happened next took 11 days. On Monday morning, Curtis brought in his own attorney from the county seat. The man wore a navy blazer and spoke in a voice that made every sentence sound like it had already been decided in a back room before anyone arrived. His argument was elegantly simple. Maggie had never been a formal employee of Ellis Carpentry. There were no pay stubs. There was no contract. Her ownership interest in his phrasing was functionally non-existent. She took care of Dad, Lorraine said. It was the only time she pushed back. It was almost a whisper. Curtis did not look at her. That's not a business position. Maggie called two attorneys in the county. The first said she would need $15,000 as a retainer. The second said the same number and added that she would probably not win. Walter had never written her into the company as a partner or an employee. She had a moral claim. She did not have a legal one. So she used the only argument she had left. She sat in the kitchen of the house she had grown up in and she told her brother that their father would have hated this, that she had given up school, that she had spent a year feeding and bathing the man whose name was painted on the side of the truck Curtis now intended to keep. Curtis leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and listened to her finish. "You're 30 years old," he said. "You don't know how any of this works. Dad left you a piece of land. Be grateful." Lorraine stood in the doorway with both hands wrapped around a mug she was not drinking from. She did not say a single word. She called Maggie that evening. Her voice was small. Maggie could hear a television in the background, some daytime show. Her sister was not really watching. "I know this isn't right. You could say no." The silence on the other end stretched out long enough that Maggie counted her own breath 3 times. "I have a marriage. I have a mortgage. I can't fight Curtis. He has the lawyers. He has the name on the deed of the office building. I don't know what I can do. You could say no. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry." She did not call again. The family house sold in 9 days. Curtis priced it to move, and a young couple from out of state took it. Maggie stood across the street the morning the movers came and watched strangers carry her mother's mirror through the front door her father had hung by hand. They would sand his floors. They would paint over the trim he had spent a weekend carving. She wanted to tell them to be careful with the built-in shelves in the hallway, the ones Walter called his favorite thing in the house. She did not say anything. She got into her car and drove. The business was restructured under Curtis's name within 2 weeks. He kept the heavy equipment and sold the rest. He let go of 3 of Walter's longtime men with a handshake and 2 weeks of pay each. Men who had spent their working lives learning the trade alongside her father, who knew the way he liked a joist set and a corner finished. Curtis brought in cheaper crews from out of county. The savings account was split between Curtis and Lorraine. Maggie's share, which she was told, came to just over $6,000 after legal fees never arrived. Curtis said the cost had run higher than expected. "It will come," he told her on the phone. It did not come. By the end of October, Margaret Ellis had a car with 140,000 miles on it, a suitcase of clothes, $310 in her checking account, and a deed to a piece of property she had never visited. She had no plan. Her mother had died when she was 3. Her father had been the last anchor she had. Her brother and sister had made it clear by what they did and what they did not say that whatever family they had once been, it had ended with Walter. She looked at the deed. 3.2 acres, a house nobody finished, $400. She drove out on a Thursday morning. The sky was overcast and the air was cool. The way late October in the Blue Ridge foothills is cool dry at the edges with the smell of wood smoke from somewhere just over the ridge. The road was cracked pavement that turned to gravel after the first mile. A few houses sat back behind split-rail fences early on, then thinned out. By the second mile, there was nothing but bare oaks and empty mailboxes and the sound of her tires on loose stone. She had looked the lot up on the county assessor's website the night before. The listing had been bare. Unfinished residential structure. Wood frame. No photograph. No description. The road ended at a wooden gate that someone had painted dark green a long time ago and had not painted again since. Beyond the gate, 3 acres of tall grass and silence. A gravel path mostly swallowed by weeds led toward a structure set back about 100 yards from the road. The house from the outside looked abandoned. Bare plywood walls, no siding, no paint. The porch had no railing. One front window was covered in plastic that snapped softly in the wind. $400. That was what the county thought this place was worth. Maggie sat in her car for a long time. She thought about the workshop in the garage of the house she had grown up in, the one Curtis had sold to strangers. The cases of hand tools her brother had probably moved out without ever opening. Her father at his desk every evening, pencil behind his ear, going over the next day's plans. In 30 years, she had never once seen Walter take a shortcut on anything. She checked her phone. No missed calls, no messages. She had not heard from her brother or her sister since the last document was signed. She got out of the car. She walked through the weeds and stepped onto the porch. The boards held. They were solid, more than solid. Level and tight, the joints clean built, the way her father would have built them, on the porch of a custom home for a paying client. She put her hand on the front door. It was heavier than she expected. Solid wood, not hollow core. She pushed. The door opened without a sound. The hinges did not squeak. Someone had oiled them, and recently enough that the oil had not yet dried into a film. Maggie stepped inside, and what she saw stopped her in the doorway, one hand still resting on the frame. Because the inside of this house had nothing to do with the outside. The interior was finished. Not in the rough, half-done way the exterior suggested. Finished with patience, with intention, with a level of craft she had only ever seen on the very best jobs her father ever ran, and never on a house built for sale because nobody could afford the labor of work like this anymore. Timber framing lined the walls, hand-joined at the corners. No nails, no metal brackets. Mortise and tin on the joints cut so tight she could not see daylight between the pieces. A stone fireplace anchored the far wall. The river rock fitted and mortared with the patience of a man who did not care how long the work took, only that it was done correctly. Built-in shelving ran along the east side of the main room. The wood was oak-sanded smooth and left unstained. The grain of each board visible and straight. Dust covered everything. A thin layer of gray over the mantel, the shelves, the wide plank floor. But beneath the dust, the house was sound. More than sound. It was beautiful. Maggie stepped further inside and let the door swing closed behind her. She stood in the center of the main room with the plumb bob still in her hand and looked at what her father had done. Every joint was clean. Every surface was level. The ceiling beams ran straight and parallel, the kind of precision that required more than a level and a square. It required hands that understood wood, that could feel when a board was true and when it was not. She walked the length of the room, running her fingers along the shelving. The shelves were not decorative. They were structural, fitted into the wall framing, with dovetail joints, each one seated tight enough to carry weight without flexing. The kitchen was at the back, separated from the main room by a half wall with an open pass-through. The cabinets were hand-built. The countertop was a single slab of butcher block, sanded and oiled, the grain running the full length of the room. No hardware. The cabinet doors hung on wooden hinges carved to sit flush. Walter had built this, not his crew, not a subcontractor. Walter, alone by hand over years she had not known about, on a piece of land none of them had ever asked about, in a house the county had valued at $400. Her knees gave out a little. She sat down on the edge of the stone hearth and pressed her palm flat against the cold floor and breathed in slowly through her nose. The plumb bob hung from her fist on its waxed cotton string. The brass tip swayed, then steadied, then stilled. Plumb, pointing at the center of the earth. A narrow staircase ran up from the back of the main room. She climbed it after a while. The treads did not creak. Each one sat flush against the stringers. The risers were uniform. The banister was smooth under her hand and warmed slightly to her touch, the way oak does when it has been worked carefully and rubbed with oil. Upstairs, 2 rooms. The larger had a window facing south over the property toward Opal's place beyond the tree line. A wooden bed frame stood against the far wall, made from the same oak as the downstairs shelving. The same tight joints, the same quiet care. The mattress was bare. The frame itself belonged in a museum. The smaller room was a workspace. A desk sat under the window, hand-built with drawers on both sides, and a surface worn smooth in the center by something heavier than a notebook. A workbench ran along the opposite wall, fitted with a vise and a tool rack, and a small shelf of books on traditional joinery. On the desk centered a leather-bound journal. The cover read in her father's careful, upright hand, "For Margaret." Maggie sat down in the desk chair. The chair did not wobble. She opened the journal. The first entry was dated 8 years before. 3 lines in pencil, the lead faded but still legible. "Bought the lot today. Tax auction. Nobody else wanted it. $400 for the only honest thing I have owned since Helen died." She pressed her fingertips flat against the page. She could hear his voice in the words, quiet, steady. The same voice that had explained foundations and framing to a girl who had sat on overturned buckets at job sites and asked the questions the grown men around her had never thought to ask. She turned the page. He described clearing the site, how he had found the footprint of an old farmhouse beneath the overgrowth. The original concrete cracked beyond repair, but the footing still partially sound. He had dug it out by hand on weekends, leveled the grade, poured new footings on a Saturday in November, when the air had been cold enough to keep the mix from setting too fast. Nobody knows about this place. That is the point. She turned the page again. The framing went up first. Walter described his technique in detail, and Maggie recognized the joints. Not modern construction. Older than that. The kind of work that required wooden pegs and hand-cut tenons, and a patience that power tools had made unnecessary in any reasonable business. My father taught me this. He learned it in the old country from his father before him. They did not use nails because nails rust and wood shrinks around them, and the joint loosens with every winter. A proper mortise and tenon holds tighter as the wood ages. The house gets stronger over time, not weaker. Elias could look at a piece of lumber and tell you what it would do in a decade, whether it would twist or check or hold straight. He could feel the moisture in a board with his palm and know whether it was ready for use. I have not been able to teach this to Curtis. I tried when he was 12. He had no patience for it. By 15, he stopped coming out to the shop with me at all. But Margaret will sit through anything if she thinks she might learn something. She always has. Maggie closed her eyes. The room was very still. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches with a sound like distant water. She read on. He wrote about coming out every Saturday, leaving before dawn, telling the family he was checking on a rural project. He wrote about working alone from sunrise until late afternoon, then driving back to town in time for dinner. He wrote about a storm in February that had blown a tarp loose and soaked the upstairs framing, and how he had dried each beam with rags and a portable heater across 2 weekends, checking the moisture content with a meter before sealing the wall. A patient man never builds a rotten house. He wrote about her. She's 23 now and starting graduate school next month. I will not see her as much. I'm proud of her, but I am also afraid. She does not know yet what people are willing to take from someone who is gentle. I hope this house is here for her one day when she needs it. I hope she opens the door and understands what I could not say with my mouth. The pencil pressed harder into the page on that sentence. Maggie ran her thumb over the indentation in the paper. She read until the light through the window began to fail. She had not noticed the day going. She had not eaten. She had not moved from the desk chair. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff and her cheeks were tight with dry tears. She did not remember crying. She went downstairs and found the fireplace. A stack of split wood sat beside it, dry and seasoned, cut to uniform length. The kindling was already laid in a small basket next to the hearth. She built a fire the way her father had taught her, paper at the bottom, kindling in a loose cone, 2 split logs on top, with a gap between them for air. The match caught, the flames climbed. The room filled with a warm, shifting light that made the timber framing glow as if it had been lit from inside the wood itself. She brought the journal downstairs and sat on the floor in front of the fire and kept reading. The pages turned slowly under her fingers. The plum bob lay beside her on the white plank floor, brass catching the firelight. A plumb line tells you what's true, even when the wall lies. She read until her eyes would not stay open anymore. She wrapped herself in the blanket from her car and lay down on the floor by the hearth and slept. The house was cold. The walls held out the wind. The sound of the fire and the silence beyond it settled around her like a second blanket. And for the first time in 11 months, she slept without listening for breath in another room. She woke to the smell of chimney smoke. Not inside, outside. And a soft, deliberate knock on the front door. Maggie sat up. The fire was down to embers. The light through the front window was the pale gray of early morning. She got to her feet and crossed the room and opened the door. An old woman stood on the porch. Button coat, short white hair, clear pale eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, both hands resting on the handle of a canvas grocery bag. I saw the smoke. Nobody has been here since Walter. Maggie did not speak. She could not yet. The old woman studied her face. The concern in her expression softened into something else. Recognition. Not just resemblance. Continuation. You are his daughter. Yes. Opal Whitcomb. I live on the next property. He used to bring me tomatoes. The morning light slanted across the porch and caught the brass of the plumb bob still in Maggie's left hand. Opal looked down at it and back up. Her eyes were wet. He told me one day a long time ago that there were things on this property I should not ask about. That when the time came, somebody would open the door. He didn't say who. He didn't have to. She lifted the canvas bag a little. I brought eggs and bread and the name of a man at the power company who owes your father a favor. May I come in? Maggie stepped back from the doorway. Opal Whitcomb crossed the threshold of the house Walter Ellis had spent 8 secret years building, and the door swung shut behind her. And somewhere in the woodwork above their heads, the old oak shifted very slightly with the change in the air, the way a house does when it recognizes that someone has finally come home. Opal set the canvas bag on the butcher block counter and looked around the kitchen, the way a person looks at a relative they have not seen in many years. Not surprised, recognizing. He never let me pass the gate, she said. Not once in 8 years. He would stand at the end of the path with a paper sack of vegetables from my garden, and we would talk about the weather. And then he would walk back up here alone. She unscrewed the thermos she had pulled from the bag and poured 2 cups of coffee into mugs she found on the open shelf above the sink. The mugs were heavy stoneware glazed the color of river clay. Walter had made them in a kiln at the community college on a Saturday morning class he never told anyone about. There were 6 of them lined up in a row on the shelf, the bottoms all stamped with a single letter W. You drink it black like he did, I do now. They stood at the counter. The morning light came in through the window over the sink and laid across the wood grain, like something being read aloud. Opal slid one of the mugs across to her. Maggie took it with both hands. The heat of it bit into her palms in a way that felt like proof of something. You need to call the power company today. The man's name is Earl Hanson. I wrote it on the bag. He will not charge you the connection fee. He will not say why, and you should not ask. Just say the lot at the end of Old Hollow, and he will know. What did my father do for him? Walter built him a wheelchair ramp the spring his wife came home from the hospital. Did it on a Sunday. Would not take a check. Maggie looked down at the coffee. It was very black and very hot, and she could see her own face in it faintly distorted by the surface. I don't know where to start. Opal did not answer right away. She finished her coffee. She set the mug down with a small, careful sound. You start with the well. Walter drilled it deep enough for year-round. He had the water tested twice. The papers are in a folder under the workbench downstairs in a green binder. You will need to flush the line and prime the pump, and have the septic inspected before you can use the bathroom for anything serious. The pipes are run. Nothing is hooked up. She turned and pointed through the half wall toward the kitchen window. There is a propane tank buried at the side of the house, 20 feet off the foundation. It has been sitting full for 3 years. The gas line into the stove is capped. You will need a plumber to open it. Opal walked toward the front door. I'm not going to stay and tell you how to live in your father's house. You will find your way. But if the smoke stops coming out of that chimney for more than 2 days in a row this winter, I am walking over with a shovel and digging you out of whatever you fell into. I am too old to attend another Ellis funeral. She closed the door softly behind her. Maggie stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. She listened to the sound of Opal's footsteps fading down the porch. She listened to the wind in the gutters her father had hung. She listened to her own breathing and noticed for the first time in almost a year that it was even. She got to work. The first week was the kind of work that produced no visible result. She walked the property line and counted the fence posts that had rotted at the base. There were 11. She found a hand auger in the workshop and a stack of fresh cedar posts already cut to length leaning against the back of the house under a tarp dry, the ends sealed with wax. Walter had bought them the spring before he was diagnosed. He had set them aside for the day she would come. She tried to dig the first post hole and broke the handle of the auger on a hidden root within 20 minutes. She sat in the grass and pressed her palms against her eyes until the urge to cry passed. Then she walked to the workshop and looked through the tool wall until she found a second auger her grandfather Elias had used brass-collared, the wood handle worn smooth by hands that had been dead for 40 years. She carried it back out to the fence line. The hole took her 3 hours. By the end of the first day, she had set one post. Her hands were blistered and her lower back felt like it had been wrapped in barbed wire. She walked into the kitchen and ate a piece of bread Opal had left and drank water from a jug and lay down on the floor by the dead fireplace because she had not had the energy to build a fire. The post stood. That was what she told herself before she fell asleep. The post stood, and it was Plumb, and her grandfather's auger had cut it. The second day she set 2 posts, the third day 3. By the end of the first week, the south fence line was finished. The wire was tight. The connections were neat. The corner braces were notched in the old way, the way Walter had drawn in one of the notebooks she had found on the workbench. She did not let herself look at the journal in those days. She knew what was in the second half of it. She had seen the handwriting tighten. She had read enough to know that the rest of the entries were not about joinery anymore. They were about her brother. She was not ready yet. On the morning of the 8th day, a pickup truck slowed at the gate. Maggie was in the yard with a wheelbarrow full of brush she had cleared from the foundation line. She straightened up. She wiped her forehead on the back of her wrist. The man in the truck was in his early 60s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had spent its whole life outdoors. He cut the engine and got out and stood with one hand on the open door of the truck, looking up the path at the house. "You don't know me. I worked for your father. 22 years. She knew the face then. She had seen it at the funeral. She had seen it at her father's office once when she was small. She could not pull up the name. Eugene Hartwell. Finnish carpentry. I heard somebody was out here. He did not move from the truck. He was waiting to be invited. "Come up," she said. He walked up the path, slowly looking at the porch boards, the way the railing was tied into the posts, the angle of the eaves. He stopped at the foot of the steps and pressed his palm flat against the porch decking and pushed down once. He nodded to himself. He said that with screws, not nails, from underneath, so nothing shows on top. She had not noticed. "May I see inside?" She stepped back from the doorway. Eugene walked into the main room and stood where she had stood the first morning, and his face did something she did not have a name for. Something underneath the skin moved and resettled. He took his hat off without thinking. He walked to the fireplace and looked at the mortar joints. He went to the shelving and ran 2 fingers along the edge of a dovetail. He climbed the stairs and was gone for a long time. When he came back down, he sat on the bottom step and put his face in his hands and stayed like that for almost a minute. I worked next to your father for 2 decades. He never said a word about this, not one word. He told me Saturdays were the rural project. There was no rural project. I know that now. Eugene wiped his face with the heel of his hand. He stood up. He put his hat back on. I am out of work, he said. Curtis let me go in November. I am too old for the cheap crews, and I will not work for the kind of men your brother hires now. If you need a hand on anything in this house, I will work for the cost of gas. That is not charity. That is what your father did for me in 1994 when my back went out and I could not feed my wife. I cannot pay you anything else. I did not ask you to. He came back on Saturday. He brought a younger man with him, a Finnish carpenter in his 30s named Wendell Coombs, who did not say much and worked with the steady focus of a man who had been taught right and remembered it. The two of them hung cedar siding on the south wall of the house while Maggie cut and primed the boards. They worked from 7 in the morning until the light failed, and they would not take the sandwiches she made until she sat down and ate one with them on the porch. 3 Saturdays later, the entire south wall was sided, and the cedar had started to silver in the air. From the road, the house looked for the first time like a house someone lived in. The hardware store called her in on a Wednesday in early November. Frank Tilden ran Tilden Building Supply out of a flat-roofed building on the main street that had been there since the Eisenhower administration. He was a wide man in his late 60s, with hands that had spent a lifetime around tools, and he wore a denim apron over a flannel shirt, the way some men wear a suit. Maggie had come in twice for screws and caulk and a new utility knife, and both times Frank had watched her move through the aisles without speaking. When she set her basket on the counter that Wednesday, he reached underneath and pulled out a ledger. Cloth-covered, lined pages. The kind of book nobody had used since before the internet. Your father opened an account here. A long time ago. Paid into it a little at a time. Told me not to say anything unless his daughter came in alone on a regular basis. Said you would know when it was time. He turned the ledger around and tapped the bottom of a column with one finger. The balance read $3,400. He never told me. He told me not to bring it up. He said you would feel like you owed somebody if he made a thing of it. He said you do not owe anybody, but you might forget that for a while. Maggie pressed her fingers against the page. She did not let herself cry, not in the store, not in front of Frank Tilden, who had known her father for 40 years and was standing behind the counter, pretending to look at something on a clipboard so she would have a moment. Use it for whatever you need, he said without looking up. Lumber, plumbing, supplies, tools, whatever. It is not a gift. It is what he saved. She bought what she needed on the account that day and drove home with the windows down. Her vision blurred so badly twice on the gravel road that she had to pull over and put her forehead against the steering wheel and wait until the world straightened out again. That night, she went back to the journal. She had been reading it in order a few entries at a sitting. She had been moving forward through the seasons of construction, the framing, the roof, the slow, careful interior work. But that night, sitting in the desk chair upstairs with the window open to the cold and the propane heater clicking softly behind her, she made herself turn to the part she had been avoiding. The handwriting tightened. The pencil pressed harder. Curtis changed the lumber supplier last month. Did not tell me until the delivery showed up at the Redmond site. The boards were lighter, cheaper grade. I pulled 3 from the stack and checked the moisture content. Too high. The grain was loose and I could see the pith in 2 of them. I told Curtis. He said the old supplier was overcharging. I asked him when price became more important than the product. He looked at me and said, "Nobody cares about quality, Dad. They care about price." She turned the page. I have been building for 40 years. I have never once delivered a wall I would not lean my own weight against. Curtis does not understand what that means. He sees the business as a spreadsheet, inputs and outputs. He does not see that a house is somebody's life. More entries followed the handwriting growing smaller, as if Walter were trying to keep the words contained. Curtis, hiring cheaper subcontractors who did not know the standard. Curtis rebidding contracts below cost and making up the difference with material downgrades the clients would never notice. Lorraine signing off on inspection paperwork because Curtis told her to, because going along was easier than pushing back. Because she had married a man who needed her brother's good opinion to keep his job at the insurance company. Walter had confronted Curtis twice, once at the office and once over dinner. Both times Curtis had told him the industry had changed and he needed to either keep up or step aside. Then the entry stopped for several weeks. When they resumed, the handwriting was different, smaller, more controlled, the strokes of a man choosing his words with care. I found the invoices today. For Cedar Hollow. She turned the page. The next sentence stood alone in the center of the paper. Everything I was afraid of is true. Maggie closed the journal. She went downstairs and built a fire because she needed to do something with her hands. She watched the flames climb and listened to the wood pop and tried to slow her breathing. Cedar Hollow. Senior Living was the name of a building she had driven past her whole life without thinking about. It sat on a rise 3 miles outside town, a long single-story complex with a covered drop-off and a lawn that the residents tended in pots along the windows. It had opened a year and a half before Walter died. Ellis Carpentry had been the general contractor. Curtis had put the bid together himself, back when Walter was first beginning to lose weight, and the family had not yet said the word cancer out loud. Curtis had won the bid by coming in 22% below the next nearest competitor. She went down to the basement workshop. The drawer in the smaller desk under the workbench was locked. She had noticed it on her first day and assumed it held papers or supplies. Now she knelt in front of it and studied the lock, small brass, the kind that takes a skeleton key. She searched the workshop for almost an hour. She checked the tool pegs and the shelf edges and the underside of every drawer. She found it taped to the back of the desk in a small envelope marked with a single pencil dot. The key turned with a soft click. Inside the drawer, a thick manila folder. The tab read in her father's handwriting, underlined twice, Coal Construction. Below it, scratched out and rewritten, Ellis Carpentry. Below that, a date. She lifted the folder out. It was heavier than she expected. She set it on the workbench and opened the cover. The first page was a photograph, a concrete pour at a job site, annotated in pencil with 2 columns of numbers, contract specifications on the left, actual materials on the right. They did not match. She turned the page. Another photograph, another set of numbers, another gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered. She kept turning. The folder held 23 photographs, each one documented with the thoroughness of a man who had spent his career reading building codes and knew exactly what a violation looked like. The last 8 pages were Cedar Hollow. The concrete had been 2 grades below the specification. The rebar had been a narrower gauge than the plans required, spaced 16 inches apart instead of 12. The compression tests, which should have been performed by an independent lab, had been signed off by a man named Thomas Mercer, who was Lorraine's husband's cousin and worked in the county inspection office. Maggie sat on the cold concrete floor of the workshop and stared at the wall and could not move. On the last page of the Cedar Hollow section, her father had written a note, not to the county, not to a lawyer, to himself. I wanted to stop them. I wanted to drive to the county office and put this folder on a desk and walk out and let it fall on whoever it fell on. But they are my children. God help me. They are my children. I could not make myself do it, so I am writing it down. All of it. And I am putting it here in this drawer in the house no one knows about, where someone braver than I am can find it when the time comes. If something goes wrong, somebody will know. And if nothing goes wrong, maybe the building holds and the people inside it grow old in peace. And I can die with what I did not do and not have it kill anyone else. She closed the folder. She put it back in the drawer. She turned the key. She walked upstairs and stood in the main room of the house her father had built, and pressed her palm flat against the stone of the fireplace until her hand was cold. She did not sleep that night. She lay on the floor by the embers and stared up at the ceiling beams. The plumb bob hung from a nail beside the door where she had hung it the first morning, and it caught the last firelight, and it did not move. A plumb line tells you what's true even when the wall lies. 11 days passed. She did not open the drawer again. She told herself she needed to think. She told herself the building had stood for 18 months and would stand another month while she figured out what to do. She told herself she was 30 years old and had nobody in the world and could not afford to bring the whole sky down on her shoulders without preparation. She kept working on the house. Eugene came on Saturday with Wendell. They installed the windows in the front of the house, real glass in real frames, replacing the plastic sheeting that had snapped in the wind for 8 years. The first time Maggie pulled the plastic away, and the morning light came through the new pane and laid clean across the floor of the main room. Eugene took off his hat and stood quiet, and Wendell put his hand on the older man's shoulder, and nobody said anything for almost a minute. That was her first small success. The house had eyes again. On the 11th night, she lay on the floor with the small radio Opal had given her, tuned low to the local news. Weather first. A county budget item. Then this. Engineers have been called to Cedar Hollow Senior Living, where overnight a section of ceiling in the East Wing dining hall collapsed during a small earth tremor felt across the region around 2 a.m. One resident, an 81-year-old man whose name has not been released, was struck by falling debris and is in stable condition at Mill Hollow Regional. 2 other residents were treated for minor injuries. The East Wing has been evacuated. Officials are investigating whether the structural failure was related to the seismic activity or to underlying defects in the building. Maggie sat up. The fire had burned down to nothing. The house was cold. She could see her breath. She stood up slowly. She walked to the door and lifted the plumb bob off the nail. She held it in her palm. The brass was cold against her skin. The cotton string trailed between her fingers. A knock came at the door. Soft. 3 times. She opened it. Opal stood on the porch in a heavy coat with her arms wrapped around herself. The morning was still pitch black behind her. Her eyes were wet and her mouth was set in a line that Maggie had not seen on her before. "My husband died at Cedar Hollow," Opal said. 3 years ago, last spring before they opened that East Wing. He was the second resident on the list when it opened. The man in the hospital bed tonight is sleeping in what used to be Harold's room. She looked Maggie in the eye. "I need you to tell me something. And I need you to tell me the truth. Did Walter know? Did he know there was something wrong with that building?" Maggie's hand closed around the plumb bob until the brass tip dug into her palm. She could not answer. The wind moved through the bare branches outside. Somewhere down the road an engine started. The first gray of dawn was beginning to lift along the ridgeline behind Opal's shoulder, and the question hung between them in the cold air waiting. Maggie stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," she said. "There is something I need to show you." Opal followed her into the main room without a word. Maggie went down to the workshop alone. She unlocked the drawer. She brought the folder upstairs and set it on the kitchen counter under the new pendant light Eugene had hung the Saturday before. She opened the cover. Opal put on her glasses. She did not sit. She turned the pages slowly. Her hands were very steady. She lingered on the Cedar Hollow section the longest. She studied the photographs of the rebar. She read the columns of numbers. She looked at the signature of Thomas Mercer on the compression test sheet, and her mouth tightened. When she finished, she closed the folder. She took her glasses off and folded them with the same care she had used on every other gesture Maggie had seen from her. "Walter could not make himself do it," she said. "Could you?" "I have not yet. You have been sitting on this for how long? 11 days. Opal nodded once. She did not say anything for a long moment. Outside, the first thin light was lifting along the ridge. "I am not going to tell you what to do with this," she said. "I am too old to send a young woman to war on my behalf. But I will tell you what I think. My husband Harold worked 38 years as a county road inspector. He believed his whole life that the job of an honest man was to put his name on what he saw and let the chips fall. He died before he ever had to make that decision about somebody he loved. I do not know what he would have done. I do not know what your father should have done. But the man in the hospital tonight did not get to choose his ceiling. Somebody chose it for him. She picked up her coat from the kitchen chair. I'm going home. I'm going to make tea and I'm going to sit on my porch and watch the sun come up. If you decide to drive into town today, the inspector's office opens at 9. Her name is Marcella Boone. She's a friend of mine. I will not call her. You will. She paused at the door. Whatever you decide, you will eat at my table tonight. That is not a question. She closed the door behind her. Maggie sat in the empty kitchen for almost an hour. The sun came up. The light moved across the butcher block counter and slid up the wall and laid itself against the spines of the joinery books on the shelf above the workbench. She made a pot of coffee on the propane stove. She drank 1 cup and let the second go cold. She walked the length of the main room and back and then again, and then she stopped in front of the door and lifted the plumb bob off its nail and held it out at arm's length. The brass tip swung once, twice, and steadied. It pointed at the center of the earth. It did not care what the wall behind it was doing. She drove into town at 10 minutes after 9. The county building inspector's office sat on the second floor of the courthouse annex behind a door that read, in plain block letters, Department of Building and Safety. The woman at the front desk asked if Maggie had an appointment. I do not, but this is about Cedar Hollow. That sentence opened the second door for her. Marcella Boone was in her late 40s. Short brown hair shot through with gray reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. A desk covered in folders sorted by colored tabs. She looked up when Maggie came in and studied her face, the way a person studies a deposition witness. You're Walter Ellis's daughter. I am. Sit down. Tell me what you have. Maggie set the folder on the desk. My father documented 23 job sites where Ellis Carpentry substituted cheaper materials than the contract specified. 8 of those pages are Cedar Hollow. The concrete is 2 grades below spec. The rebar is undersized and improperly spaced. The compression test was signed off by a county inspector named Thomas Mercer, who is my sister's husband's cousin. The east wing collapsed last night. Marcella opened the folder. For the next 11 minutes, she did not speak. She put on her glasses. She turned pages. She compared columns. She cross-referenced the signatures. She picked up her phone twice and set it down again without dialing. When she reached the last page, the one where Walter had written his note to himself, she read it twice. The second time, her hand went up to her mouth. Your father wrote this. He did. He wrote it years ago. He started keeping the record almost from the beginning. The Cedar Hollow section is dated about a year before he died. Marcella closed the folder. She looked at Maggie for a long time without blinking. Miss Ellis, do you understand what you have just handed me? I do. Do you understand what is going to happen to your brother? I do. She nodded slowly. She picked up the phone. She made 2 calls without taking her eyes off Maggie. Then she stood up. She held out her hand. Thank you. I will not pretend this is going to be easy. I will not pretend any of it is going to feel good. But there are 63 people who live in that building, and some of them do not have anybody else who is going to ask the question. Today you asked it. Maggie walked out of the courthouse annex into the late morning sun. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs in the car until they stopped. Then she drove home and did not stop on the way, not at the hardware store, not at the gas station, not at the place where the road turned to gravel, and the trees closed in over the windshield, until she was back inside the house her father had built, and the door was shut behind her. The investigation moved quickly after that. Marcella Boone called in an independent structural engineering firm from out of state. The Cedar Hollow East Wing was condemned within 72 hours. The remaining wings were temporarily closed while every load-bearing member was tested. The residents were relocated to the wing of the Methodist Church that the congregation had quietly retrofitted for emergency housing. And the women of the congregation served 3 meals a day in the fellowship hall, and nobody asked who was paying for it, because everybody understood that was not the question that mattered. Curtis was charged in early February: fraud, reckless endangerment, falsification of inspection records. The county prosecutor built the case around Walter's documentation, supplemented by material invoices the investigation uncovered in the company's own files. Curtis's attorney filed motions. The judge denied most of them. Curtis was released on bail and went home to a house his wife was no longer living in. Lorraine took a plea: probation, 300 hours of community service, full disclosure of every project where she had signed off on inspection paperwork she had reason to doubt. Her husband kept his insurance job. Thomas Mercer lost his. Curtis came to the property on a cold evening in early March. Maggie was on the porch when she heard the car on the gravel. She did not get up. She watched him park at the gate. She watched him walk up the path the way a man walks towards something he is not sure he's allowed to enter. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He had lost weight. The charcoal suit was gone. He wore jeans and a barn jacket that had belonged to their father, the elbows worn through to the canvas underneath. "May I sit?" She nodded toward the step. He sat. He did not look at her. "I drove out here twice last month," he said. "Both times I sat in the car at the end of the road and could not make myself open the gate. Tonight I told myself I would either come up or stop pretending I might." The wind moved through the pines along the fence line. A barred owl called from somewhere on Opal's property. Did he really build all of this himself? He did. Curtis pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because you would have asked what it was worth." He let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and resolved into neither. He sat with his head down for a long moment. "I tried to stop myself once," he said. "On the Cedar Hollow bid. I had the numbers in front of me. I knew what the materials had to cost to come in under the next competitor. I sat in the truck in the parking lot for 2 hours that day. I thought about driving home and telling Dad I could not do it. I thought about telling the client we could not bid that low without cutting somewhere. I sat there until it got dark. Then I drove back to the office and I signed the bid." "What stopped you from driving home?" He looked up at her for the first time. His face in the porch light was older than she had ever seen it. "I thought you would judge me less than he would. That is the truth. I thought if it ever came out, you would be the one I could talk to. I built this whole thing on the assumption that my sister was softer than my father. And then he left you the folder." He shook his head slowly. "You are 30 years old. You did the one thing he could not do in 40 years. I do not know how to live with that. I am going to have to learn." He stood up. He did not reach for her. He did not ask for anything. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I do not think I am ready to be forgiven. I came out here to tell you that I saw what he built, and I understand now what I was never going to understand any other way. That is all." He walked down the steps. He paused at the bottom and turned back. "The sign at the gate? You used the original year, 1978. You did not start over. It was never my company to start." He nodded once. He walked back down the path and through the gate and got into his car and sat there for almost a minute before he started the engine. The headlights swept across the front of the house and across the new cedar siding that had silvered now and across the porch where Maggie sat. And then the car was gone down the gravel road and the night closed back in. She stayed on the porch a long time. The plumb bob hung from a nail beside the door. The brass caught the porch light. It did not move. Lorraine started coming on Saturdays in the middle of March. She did not say much the first few weeks. She brought coffee for the men working on the house, and she swept the workshop at the end of each day, and she carried lumber when somebody asked her to, and she went home in the evening without staying for dinner. The fourth Saturday she stayed. She helped Opal clean tomato seeds at the kitchen table for next year's garden, and she cried very quietly into the dish towel. And Opal did not pretend not to notice, and also did not say anything about it. That was the beginning of something. Maggie did not have a name for it yet. Opal got a letter in the second week of April. She brought it across the property line on a Tuesday evening, holding it in both hands, the way a person holds water they do not want to spill. She sat on the porch step. She did not open the envelope. "It is from my son," she said. "He left 30 years ago. He sold the family farm out from under me the year after his father died, and he moved to Oregon, and he has not written once." She turned the envelope over. "He saw a story on the television," she said. "The Cedar Hollow story. The young woman in Mill Hollow who turned in her own brother to protect a building full of strangers." He said in the letter that he sat in front of the screen and could not move for an hour after it was over. He said he thought about his mother. He said he had been telling himself for 3 decades that what he did to me was a long time ago and not worth coming back to fix. He said the woman on the television had not let herself off that hook. So he was writing to me to ask if he could come home. What did you write back? I have not written back yet. I am sitting with it. I have earned the right to sit with it. Maggie reached over and took her hand. Opal held on tight. They sat there on the porch step until the sun went down behind the ridge, and the first frogs of the season started up from the pond at the back of the property, and the air smelled of turned earth from the garden, where Opal had begun setting out her seedlings for the year. The sign went up on the gate post on the first Saturday in April. Maggie had painted it herself in the workshop on a piece of clear-grained cedar she had been saving since November. Block letters in dark blue, the same blue Walter had used on the original company trucks 40 years before. Ellis Carpentry, founded 1978. Below the name, in smaller letters, a single line: by hand, by the grain, by the plumb line. Eugene was in the yard when she hung it. Wendell stood beside him. Frank Tilden had driven out from the hardware store on his lunch break. And the framing man, whose name was Houston Pell, was there too, the 4 of them looking at the sign as if it were the unveiling of something larger than a piece of cedar with words on it. Opal stood on the porch with a coffee mug in her hand. Lorraine sat on the steps with her chin on her knees. A truck slowed at the end of the road. Maggie turned. The truck stopped at the gate. The engine idled. The driver did not get out for a long moment. She could see the shape of him through the windshield in the morning light. Then the door opened. Curtis stepped out. He stood at the gate with one hand on the post, looking at the sign she had hung. He did not come through. He stood there a long time. He read the words. He looked past the sign at the house, at the cedar siding, at the porch railing that had not been there when he was a boy and would never be there in any house he had ever built, at the chimney with the smoke coming from it, at his sister. He nodded once, slowly. Then he opened the gate himself and walked through. Nobody spoke as he came up the path. He did not look at any of them. He walked up the steps. He stopped in front of Maggie. His eyes were wet and his hands were empty. "May I come inside?" She held the door open. He walked into the main room of the house their father had built, and he stood in the center of it in the light coming through the windows. Eugene had hung on the white plank floor Walter had laid by hand beneath the ceiling beams that ran straight and parallel across the room. He turned in a slow circle. He put his hand on the stone of the fireplace. He pressed his palm flat against the mortar joint. He held it there. He did not say anything. He did not have to. Maggie went and took the plumb bob off its nail beside the door. She walked over to him and stood beside him at the fireplace, and she pressed the brass weight into his palm and closed his fingers around it, the way her father had closed hers around it the week before he died. "A plumb line tells you what's true," she said, "even when the wall lies." Curtis lowered his face into his free hand and did not lift it again for a long time. Outside, the others stayed on the porch and in the yard. Eugene poured coffee from a thermos into the stoneware mugs Walter had thrown on a Saturday morning at the community college. Frank Tilden showed Houston Pell the dovetail joint on the porch railing. Lorraine and Opal stood together at the foot of the steps, not talking, just standing in the morning light with their shoulders almost touching. The fire from the stove inside the house sent a thin gray ribbon of smoke straight up into the still air. It rose past the chimney cap. It rose above the silvered cedar of the new siding. It rose into the blue April sky, and it did not bend. It went straight up the way smoke does in still air, the way a plumb line falls in a quiet room, the way a thing that is true holds its line whether or not anyone is watching. The house stood. The foundation that Walter had dug by hand on a cold November Saturday 8 years before stood beneath it. The man who had taught him how to dig it was dead 40 years, and the woman who would inherit it was 30 years old, and had her father's tape measure on her belt, and her grandfather's plumb bob in her brother's shaking hand, and the line that ran from Elias's hands to Walter's hands to her own was straight. It had always been straight. Somebody just had to be willing to look. If you have ever been the one left holding what nobody else thought was worth anything, if you have ever opened a door at the end of a long road and found something inside it that the people who laughed at you would never understand, tell me in the comments. What did you build out of what they threw away? Stay warm tonight. Stay close to the ones who showed up. And if you are listening to this in the dark with the lamp turned low, know that there are still houses out there at the end of forgotten roads with people inside them who measured twice and built the joints by hand and left the door unlocked for whoever was strong enough to walk through it. Sleep well.